welcome to the Discernment Drop. This is where we take on complex, often challenging sources to give you that high-level synthesis, that nuance you need to really understand what's going on.
Exactly. Our whole mission here is to get past just the surface-level information and really grapple with the deep structural changes and historical patterns that are shaping our world.
And today, the source material we're digging into is, well, it's essential for anyone trying to get their head around the intersection of faith, law, and culture.
It really is.
We're analyzing a paper from December 2025. It's titled The Quiet Criminalization of Christianity, a historical, cultural, and spiritual analysis of how the modern world could criminalize the faith. And it's by Pastor John L. Widdifield.
And that title, it really forces you to stop and think. The core argument that Pastor John Widdifield puts forward is this idea that Orthodox Christianity could become, functionally illegal in a modern liberal society.
But the key is how. And this is what I think is so arresting about the paper. We're not talking about the old images of tyranny.
No, not at all.
No gulags, no dictators burning Bibles in the public square. He argues that the suppression happens through what he calls silent, bureaucratic, and this is a critical part, psychological redefinitions.
That's the key synthesis. It's not a prediction of some violent future. It's a recognition of historical patterns just adapting. Using the tools of the 21st century. The argument is that modern systems can achieve the same ends, but quietly, by redefining words like morality, truth, and especially harm.
Until the simple practice of your faith becomes, well, incompatible with holding a job or having a bank account.
Right.
So look, our goal here for you isn't to engage in any kind of fear-mongering. It's to help you grasp the structural changes at play, to really understand how these patterns form and the theological nuances when a society starts trying to regulate what is good or safe. We're dissecting the machinery of it.
And to ground this all, Pastor John does something really smart right at the start. He takes us from our modern digital world all the way back to the ancient one.
To Rome.
To the Roman Empire. To set a baseline for what this actually looks like.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because when we think of Rome, we think of lions, right?
We do. The Colosseum, gladiators. But Pastor John argues the real reason for the persecution was much more structural. It wasn't just bloodlust.
Right, it was systemic.
Yeah.
He stresses that we often get the why wrong. It wasn't because Christians were just odd. It was because they refused the totalizing claim of the Roman state.
Yes, and he's very clear. Christian violence was never the issue. They weren't raising armies. Their offense was their quiet, consistent resistance to the empire's whole ideology.
So what were those points of resistance he lays out four, I think?
He does. And the first one is the most important. Exclusivity and loyalty. They just refused to put Caesar on the same level as Christ. Their ultimate citizenship, they said, was in heaven, not Rome. And that directly undermines the divine authority of the emperor. It was an attack on the very foundation of Roman power.
It's a political claim dressed up as theology. If Caesar's just a guy, the whole system starts to wobble.
Exactly. The second offense was their, what he calls their moral inflexibility. Christianity brought in these non-negotiable standards on things like sexuality, infanticide, which was common then, and that directly contradicted Roman customs.
So they looked antisocial, like they weren't team players.
That's a good way to put it. Which leads to the third point, their resistance to state ideology. They wouldn't go to the festivals or join the professional guilds if it meant, participating in idolatry. To a Roman, that just looked like disloyalty.
And the final one was about worship.
The fourth point, yes. Their unwillingness to worship the empire's gods. And you understand, those gods weren't just spiritual ideas. They were the scaffolding of the state. They were what guaranteed the peace, the Pax Romana.
So refusing to worship them wasn't just atheism. It was seen as treason.
It was. And this is the connection Pastor John makes to today. The totalizing system changes. It's not a god emperor anymore. It's a secular ideology. But the core demand is identical.
You will bow to the dominant moral vision.
Or your faith must be suppressed. It's the logical conclusion for any system that demands total buy-in. Suppression is just what the state does to protect its own coherence.
Okay, so let's pivot. Let's come back to the 21st century. Pastor John says the modern tool set isn't the lion's mouth. It's a license application. It's a bank's compliance policy.
Right. The methods are subtle now. They're systemic. They're decentralized. Instead of the state sending soldiers, it just uses the systems of control that are already built into modern life.
He calls them quiet, suffocating mechanisms. And they're so effective because they're mostly administrative and technological.
Which makes them almost impossible to fight in court. The first one he lists is bureaucratic enforcement and reclassification. So you take an existing regulatory body, a professional board, a zoning committee, and you just quietly repurpose it to police ideology instead of, say, professional conduct.
And then there's the psychological angle, which is, frankly, it's disturbing.
It is. The use of psychological diagnostics. He argues that deep conviction, theological certainty, it's increasingly being labeled as a kind of mental problem, a form of social toxicity, or even a precursor to extremism.
So it's not a legal dispute over rights anymore. It's a mental health crisis that needs to be managed.
And that is an incredibly powerful move because it sidesteps the whole debate. If your faith is a disorder, then the answer isn't dialogue, it's mandated treatment or restriction.
And you add to that the modern tools, hate speech laws that keep expanding their definitions, and of course, algorithmic censorship, which can just delete you from the public square.
And then the economic pressure, financial exclusion. Banks, payment processors, they can just cut you off based on a vague ideological risk. And the power of professional licensure boards. I mean, if you need to comply ideologically to keep your license as a teacher or a doctor,
then your faith is effectively regulated out of your career.
Precisely. And the thread that connects all of these is the reclassification of biblical conviction as harm. That's the foundational shift. It's no longer a conversation about rights, it's a conversation about public health and safety.
So the state isn't saying your worship is wrong. It's saying your belief system is causing measurable harm, distress, and trauma to people, and we, as the state, have to step in and stop it.
That shift from sin to sickness, that's the ultimate political move. Because once it's about harm, the state feels it has a mandate to intervene.
So Pastor John's big insight here is that Christianity can be made illegal without ever being officially banned. It's just suffocated, digitally, financially, professionally, until it's just too costly to operate in the open.
And that brings us to the deep architecture of his argument, the 5 foundational shifts that he says are already happening. These are the preconditions that make all of this possible.
Right. This is the why. Why are those tools we just talked about becoming so effective?
Exactly. These are the big ideological changes in society that make suppression seem not just possible, but justified. Yeah. Necessary, even.
Okay, let's start with the first one, the redefinition of morality around identity. This seems to be at the heart of the whole conflict.
It's a radical break from history. For centuries, morality was behavioral. It was about your actions. An external standard, whether from Aristotle or the Bible, judged what you did.
Right, stealing is wrong, lying is wrong, the focus was on the act.
But this new framework shifts the moral center inward. The self becomes sovereign, and so the guiding principle is no longer about actions, it's about identity. The new maxim is, questioning my identity is an act of violence.
And that creates an immediate, irreconcilable conflict with basic biblical teachings.
Instantly. Because any core Christian claim about gender, about sin and repentance, about Christ being the only way to salvation by its very nature, it has to judge certain behaviors or identities as falling short of a divine standard.
And under this new identity-based system, just stating that belief is classified as an act of aggression.
And Pastor John gives the specific vocabulary that's used. It's not just called disagreement. It's labeled as psychological harm, emotional violence, oppression, extremism, an act of discrimination.
And once you successfully apply those labels,
the state has its mandate. If a pastor's sermon about marriage is classified as emotional violence, then the state, as the guardian of public safety, feels it has a duty to restrict the source of that violence.
It reframes protected religious speech as a prosecutable offense, which leads directly into his second precondition, the state's expansion into the realm of meaning and psychology. He calls it the therapeutic regime.
Yes, and this is such a critical concept. The therapeutic state doesn't see its main job as protecting objective rights, like free speech. It sees its job as managing the subjective, mental, and emotional well-being of its citizens.
So the highest public good becomes emotional comfort, affirmation.
Which is a completely different model of government, and the Christian worldview is a direct threat to that model.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the state says the highest good is feeling affirmed, the church says the highest good is objective truth and submission to God. Christianity teaches objective moral boundaries that often require discomfort and sacrifice. It denies that the self is sovereign. It demands repentance, which is a painful rejection of your old self.
So anything that challenges the sovereignty of feelings, like the concept of sin, is seen as inherently harmful and antisocial by this therapeutic state.
And this is not just theory. Pastor John points to a very real, very current example of this. Laws against conversion therapy. He calls this the embryo of illegality.
Okay, that's a key point. Let's unpack that. How do those specific laws demonstrate this encroachment?
Well, these laws are already on the books in many places, and they criminalize certain kinds of prayer, counseling, and pastoral care. Specifically, if the goal is to help someone align their behavior or identity with orthodox biblical teaching. And here's the crucial part. It often applies even if the person wants that counseling.
So the state is basically defining a specific type of pastoral care as inherently harmful psychological manipulation, regardless of the individual's own beliefs or consent.
Exactly. The state is asserting jurisdiction over a person's inner spiritual life. It's deciding what kind of prayer is legal. And that sets a huge precedent. It's a blueprint for criminalizing all sorts of orthodox pastoral care down the line.
A really powerful example, and it transitions perfectly to precondition 3, the fusion of government, tech, and corporate power. This seems to be the big structural difference between now and ancient Rome.
It is. In Rome, as Pastor John says, you just needed one guy, the emperor, to sign an edict. Now, you don't need a centralized authority because the enforcement it's outsourced. It's distributed across this huge private sector ecosystem.
So the government doesn't have to formally ban your faith if the big tech companies, the banks, and major corporations can create a de facto illegality.
That's the quiet genius of it. The state can maintain this illusion of constitutional protection, while private companies, often under pressure from things like ESG scores or DEI policies, do the actual enforcement.
Let's get specific about the mechanisms he identifies.
It starts with social media. Platforms banning sermons or articles as hate speech. That's not a small thing. It's erasure from the modern public square. Then you have the financial institutions. Banks citing vague, high-risk policies to close the accounts of Christian nonprofits.
And what about in the workplace?
Corporate DEI policies are a huge driver. They often define traditional biblical morality on issues like marriage or gender as bigotry, which makes it very difficult for an Orthodox Christian to advance in their career or even stay employed. And then you have app stores removing Christian apps, payment processors refusing to handle donations.
So the big takeaway from Widdifield here is that illegality today is mostly economic and digital. If you can't transact, you can't communicate, you can't work, your faith is effectively outlawed no matter what the law says on paper.
Which brings us to precondition 4, the redefinition of public safety to include ideological compliance. This is the rhetorical trick that makes it all palatable to the public.
It gives persecution a clean, sterile name. Protection. The government isn't suppressing a faith. It's protecting citizens from a dangerous ideology.
It's a brilliant strategic move. It shifts the entire conversation from a religious freedom dispute to a public safety issue. And once you do that, the state can activate its primary mission, which is to protect its citizens.
What are some of the labels, he says, are being applied to Christian doctrine to make this case?
He points to a consistent set of words: radical, extremist, destabilizing, incompatible with democracy, harmful to children, and a threat to social cohesion. Notice the language is aimed at the doctrine itself, not just the actions of a few people. The belief system is portrayed as the hazard.
So once you successfully label the faith as a threat to public order, restricting it no longer looks like persecution. It looks like a necessary safety measure.
And finally, there's precondition 5, the collapse of cultural Christianity. This is about losing the social buffer that used to protect the faith.
Right. Pastor John lays out this 3-phase historical track. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Phase 1 is when the church is a cultural force. Its values are generally respected, and the faith is tolerated. That was the West for a long time.
Phase 2 is the loss of influence. The faith gets marginalized, its claims are challenged, but it's still legally restricted, not outlawed. He argues we've been in the late stages of Phase 2 for a while.
And Phase 3 is when the church is in direct contradiction of the new moral order. At that point, the faith is seen as an existential threat, and it becomes actively persecuted or suppressed. His argument is that we are moving from Phase 2 to Phase 3 very, very quickly.
And when that happens, the cultural and political will to protect religious freedom just evaporates. The suppression can be quiet because very few people are left to cry out against it.
Okay, so if those 5 preconditions are the foundation, the why, then the next part of his paper is about the how, the operational mechanisms. He lays out 7 converging forces that actually implement this quiet criminalization.
And these aren't just theories. He's pointing to things that are already happening in various places.
Exactly. These are the practical tools. So force 1 is speech codes and hate speech laws. And he's careful to distinguish this from legitimate moderation of, direct incitement to violence.
He's talking about the expansion of these laws to target specific Christian doctrines.
Right. Core tenets about sexuality, identity, the exclusivity of Christ. These ideas are now being legally classified as inherently harmful speech. The specific labels are things like emotional abuse, incitement, or discriminatory speech.
And the impact of that is huge. Suddenly, preaching certain parts of the Bible could become a chargeable offense.
And he notes this is already a reality in parts of Europe and Canada where their laws are different. It provides a clear roadmap. The pulpit itself becomes a legal liability.
Force 2 is maybe the most unsettling. The redefinition of parenthood and child welfare.
It's insidious because it strikes at the heart of religious transmission. The claim is that traditional Christian moral instruction, especially around gender and sexuality, is inherently harmful, psychologically damaging, or even abusive to a child.
So the state's focus shifts from protecting a child's physical safety to mandating their ideological and emotional safety.
Yes, and that puts Christian schools, homeschooling, even just religious instruction in the home under direct threat. And again, he points to legal precedent for this in Canada, the UK, and in certain family court cases in the US. It's the therapeutic state saying its authority over a child's moral formation trumps the parent's religious authority.
Which sets up Force 3, revocation of professional licenses. This is how the illegality spreads one profession at a time.
It targets people in public-facing, state-sanctioned roles, pastors, counselors, teachers, doctors. They're especially vulnerable because their livelihood depends on these licensing boards, which are often the first to adopt the new state ideologies.
And the grounds for losing your license would be things like what?
Refusing to affirm certain beliefs about gender or sexuality, failing a mandatory ideological compliance training, or declining to participate in a procedure or offer counsel that violates your faith. The pressure is existential. Conform or lose your ability to work.
Force 4 is pure economics. Financial deplatforming. This is that operational suffocation we talked about.
If Christianity gets redefined as extremism, as a threat, then its ability to operate financially just disappears. The financial system is the lifeblood of any modern organization.
So we're talking about churches losing their tax-exempt status, banks closing their accounts, payment processors refusing to handle donations, even being denied basic insurance to own a building.
Right. The church might still exist spiritually, but it's crippled. It can't pay its staff, maintain its property, or receive donations. Financial illegality is one of the quickest ways to make an organization disappear.
Force 5 moves to the digital world. Algorithmic suppression. This is aimed at evangelism and communication.
This is the battle for the next generation. If biblical teaching gets flagged by algorithms as harmful, unsafe, or misinformation, the consequences are catastrophic for outreach.
So sermons get taken down, Christian content gets demoted in search results, so no one can find it. Digital outreach just collapses.
And Pastor John has a powerful line here. He says, algorithmic outlawing is nearly as effective as legal outlawing, because if you can't be found online today, you are, for all practical purposes, invisible. You're starved of oxygen.
Force 6 is about language, the new definition of radicalization.
This is a classic historical pattern. You take the core practices of a group's devotion, in this case, things like intense prayer, fasting, evangelism, the belief in the exclusivity of Christ, and you relabel them.
You reinterpret them using the language of national security. So deep piety becomes radicalism. Devotion becomes fundamentalism. Theological seriousness is linked to being a public threat.
It's a linguistic weapon. It prepares the public to see committed Christians not as citizens exercising their rights, but as potential threats that need to be monitored.
And that leads to the final force, Force 7. Church attendance reframed as extremist gathering. This is where all the other pressures converge on the physical meeting.
And it has deep historical echoes. Rome claimed Christians were subversive for meeting in secret. The modern justifications are more bureaucratic, but the outcome is the same. Restrictions could be enforced through public health mandates, like we saw with COVID, or concerns about political extremism in sermons, or even just hyper-aggressive enforcement of zoning and fire codes.
So the conclusion here from Pastor John is that churches won't be banned outright. They'll be regulated out of existence. The cumulative pressure just becomes too much to bear.
So after laying all that out, the preconditions, the mechanisms, the paper shifts to the consequences. And this is where he makes a really counterintuitive argument about refinement.
Right. It's not all doom and gloom. He sees this external pressure, as painful as it is, as a clarifying force.
Let's start with the first consequence, though. Faith will become expensive, and not just in terms of money.
Socially expensive.
Yes. The cost will be social capital. He argues that being an open, Orthodox Christian will increasingly cost you promotions, job opportunities, social credibility, and acceptance in elite circles.
It's like a non-official social credit system, where theological orthodoxy lowers your score, compromise becomes the path to comfort.
But this is where he introduces that paradox. Historically, when all the comfortable cultural baggage gets stripped away, what's left is the committed core. And that's when the church actually gets stronger, purer, and more effective. The cost separates the real from the nominal.
The second consequence brings the criminalization home. Christian speech will be treated as dangerous. This is where it gets very personal, especially for leaders.
The example he gives is stark. A pastor quotes from Romans 1 in a sermon. Under these new frameworks, he could plausibly be charged with discriminatory speech or causing psychological harm. And he's clear. This isn't a future hypothetical. It has already been tested in courts in Europe and parts of North America.
And the ultimate pressure point is the family. The state asserting its right to override parental authority on moral formation.
This is the final conflict. He suggests parents could be forced to choose between Christ and custody of their children if their religious instruction is deemed harmful by a social welfare agency. That is the ultimate tool to force submission to the state as the supreme moral authority.
That leads to consequence 3, the move underground. First digitally, then physically. He's very specific about the order here.
Right. The pressure always starts in the digital realm. It's scalable, it's easy to deny, and you can justify it with platform safety rules. You have to make the faith invisible online before you can make it impossible offline.
So you start with demonetized ministries, closed bank accounts, banned channels. The church gets erased from the digital world.
And only after that, once it's digitally isolated, does the physical pressure really ramp up. Using those zoning laws and safety regulations we talked about, you cut it off from the public square, then you force it into physical isolation.
Which brings us to the final and most theological consequence. The faithful remnant will grow stronger. This is really the thesis of the whole paper, in a way.
It is. It's the counterbalance to the fear. When the state says your faith harms society, the church is forced to remember what it really is. A kingdom that is not of this world. The pressure is a refining fire.
It separates the cultural Christians, who are just along for the ride, from the deeply committed, who see the cost and decide their faith is worth it.
And the church that emerges from that is different. It's braver. It's pure in its doctrine. It's decentralized. It looks a lot more like the early church under Rome.
So as we wrap this up, this deep dive into Pastor John L. Widdifield's analysis really forces a new way of thinking about what tyranny even looks like in the 21st century.
It's not the spectacle of violence. It's the slow, quiet erosion by bureaucracy, technology, and a therapeutic ideology.
But it's critical to remember the core message of the paper isn't annihilation. It's refinement. The church that might emerge from this is smaller, maybe, but also purer, braver, and much more resilient.
And that whole process, that quiet criminalization, is only possible because of these foundational substitutions in how we think. Pastor John lays them out as the real agents of illegality.
Let's list them. First, truth is redefined as harm. If a fact causes emotional distress, the feeling wins.
Good is redefined as evil. Traditional virtues like fidelity or self-control get recast as bigotry.
Identity replaces morality. The self, not an external standard, becomes the source of right and wrong.
The self replaces God. The human psyche, managed by the state, becomes the ultimate sovereign.
Bureaucracy replaces tyranny. Suppression happens through paperwork, not prisons.
And maybe the most personal one for all of us. Comfort replaces conviction. We prioritize social and economic ease over costly truths.
Widdifield's final takeaway, though, is one of profound spiritual hope. He says, Christianity may be outlawed, but Christ never will be.
And that points to the final question for you, the listener. The challenge here isn't just to spot the mechanisms of suppression. It's to discern the difference between institutional comfort, which is fragile and disappearing, and personal conviction, which endures.
So if Pastor John is right, if the church actually gets stronger through this refinement, then the really provocative question for you is this.
What elements of cultural Christianity in your own life, what compromises made when the faith was comfortable and tolerated, need to be shed now to prepare for this more challenging phase? The real task is to audit your own faith to see how much of it relies on structures that are already being dismantled.
A challenging, but I think a very clarifying analysis. That's the core synthesis from this edition of the Discernment Drop. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time, keep seeking the knowledge that leads to wisdom.